Hello! Welcome back to the next episode of my building series for Chunk Wars, which is my first minigame for Minecraft. And as you can probably see today, we're going to be tackling the end chunk. So we're starting here in a different world and dimension, rather than my normal development world. And we're going to kick off the episode with a quick tour of the end, and talk about the key features that it has to offer me as a map developer, and the things that I want to include in the final Chunk Wars arena. So first up, and probably the thing that makes the end most distinctive, is this endstone block, which is a very strange and unnatural combination of shades of this kind of beige and green, and then these dirty light brown kind of colours that give a very odd, bleak and barren look to the landscape. And I definitely want to capture that look and feel, and it should be pretty easy because we'll be using endstone as the primary building material, so that should happen fairly naturally. The next thing I want to talk about are these obsidian pillars, which come in a range of different shapes and sizes. So we've got a short squat pillar here, which is almost circular in shape. We've got a slightly taller one here, which is kind of square in shape. And there's one over there which is a smaller circle, sort of a halfway house between these two. And each one of them, as you can see, has got these interesting entities on top. So we've got a bedrock block, which is permanently on fire, because bedrock doesn't go out if you set it on fire in the end. Not that you'd ever be able to get a bedrock block and bring it here in survival, but it's interesting to note. And we've got this spinning cube entity here on the top, and we can't get that block in the overworld. I've tried playing about with this already and trying to get it into the game, but it's just not possible to reproduce it right now. I'm hoping that one day that'll be possible and I can stick them on top of obsidian pillars, because I have an end chunk in my mind with obsidian pillars protruding out from the surface and then probably a block on fire on the top, but these spinning entities, which would make quite a distinctive look and feel. And the final thing I want to talk about as an environmental feature is, if we look around, we can see that the sky and the scenery around is very dark and foreboding, and that's the nature of the biome we're in. So the biome type in the end is set to sky, and that changes the colour of the sky around us, and that is going to be carried over to the overworld. So we'll have an interesting dynamic lighting change for players as they move through the central area of the map, because the end chunk will be in the centre of the map, and as they move through that, they'll get this interesting sky change, but they'll still be able to see the sun and the moon, which of course don't exist in the end. And I'll show you that in a minute when we get back to the development world. And then the final thing, because it's going to be set to a sky biome, we're going to have lots of natural enderman spawns and no other mobs spawning. And that's everything I want to cover. So let's jump back to the development world and we'll start building. Right then, so here we are back in my development world, and you can see I've started mapping out some thoughts for the end chunk already. But before we do that, I'm just going to show you quickly what I meant by the dynamic lighting change. And I've set this 16 by 16 area here, every column in this chunk, to a sky biome, which is obviously in the overworld. So when we move through here, we're going to see some of the elements of the sky biome take place in this environment, and you'll see what I mean now. So if we fly in, we can see the lighting change immediately. So we've still got the horizon line, which we wouldn't normally see in the end, and we've got this very dark sky, and the sun is a different colour, and if we move out, it changes back. And that's the kind of thing that players are going to experience as they approach the end chunk in-game and then leave it. I think that's going to be an interesting feature of the gameplay. Okay, so let's now look at the end chunk itself and talk a little bit about what I want to do in this space and my thoughts so far. So we've seen the end, and it's this bleak and barren landscape, and I want to try and capture the look and feel of that and carry it through onto and into the inside of our end chunk in the Chunk Wars arena. And the way I thought about doing that is by creating a short maze which would have that sort of bleak feel running around. It would all look the same in every direction you turned, and it would be difficult for teams and players to find their way around. So there'll be some key resources down in the very basement which players might want to try and rush at the start of the game to grab for their team, but they're going to be needing to be coordinated about that rush, because I'm going to design the arena in such a way and provide resources in different points that teams will be able to get to the centre very, very quickly via, ender pearl or a fast bridge with 2 people. But that might leave them exposed to, say, a team who turns up 20-30 seconds later with a sword or some basic armour. So this team coming in would have the advantage, unless the team who's rushing it full on can get in, grab the resources and get out. And I'm going to try and make it in such a way that there's a 30-second window or so for the various different rush strategies available, in which teams and players can arrive in this central chunk, and it'll create fist fights and engagements with very little armour and weapons right at the start of the game. And I think that's going to be a really interesting dynamic to play with. So I'm going to go ahead now and start thinking about the physical space we've got here and how I could construct the maze beyond just these basic stairways I've constructed. And then we'll come back and we'll look at that together. Right, so I started to think about the physical space we've got available and what the environment will feel like for a player down at the block level. And I've thrown in these obsidian outlines here on the edges to represent the bases of what I think will be the obsidian pillars. So 2 blocks in from the side, all consistent in terms of distance, and I've just popped a glass block in the centre there to represent possibly an enderman spawner. I need to test how many endermen I'm going to get naturally spawning when I set all the biome types, and if I need more then we'll pop a couple of extra spawners in. So I've done 2 kind of versions here of a basic structure for a medium maze and a more difficult maze. So players would drop down or run down this kind of stairway, 1 wide at the moment, although I'm thinking about extending this to 2, and I'll develop my thoughts on that in a bit. And then they would move around this environment and they'd have different levels where they could drop down or use stairways to get down, and then finally into the basement area and grab the resources and try and get back out. Now you can see already, if I created 1 wide corridors, that they could easily be quite twisty and turny and very confusing for players to run around, even just in that small space. And I quite like that as a concept. Let's now look at the more difficult version I was suggesting, which has got 4 levels, and each of them are 2 blocks high. So we got 1, 2, 3, and 4 down to the basement. And I think this is the template and structure I'm going to use to construct the maze. I'm next going to start thinking about how players will enter and leave this space, whether I want 4 entrances, as I've got sort of suggested right now, or just simply 1 on each side, because that might give me more options in terms of how the staircases flow around the internals of the chunk. So I'll take this onto the next step and then we'll look at that. Okay, so here is a mock-up to represent the next stage of my thoughts about the space we've got to play with and how I want to design this. So you might be able to see, it's difficult with the glass, but you should be able to see here that I've got 2 wide entrances now, rather than the 4 1 wide entrances we had on that chunk. And that's because I think I'm going to go with paths and internals for players to navigate which are 2 wide. We've got a 16 by 16 square, and if we take 2 blocks in we end up with a 12 by 12 on the inside, and that lends itself very well to 2 by 2 or 2 wide paths on the internals. And as you can see here, it gives us 6 2 by 2 squares to break the chunk down in, to think about it in a modular way, so that when we move players around the physical space, it's a lot easier to spin them around and cause them to lose their sense of direction and where they might be facing. And this kind of modular way of thinking will help me a lot when I'm designing the maze. So I'm really pleased with this. There's a couple of other features I want to include before I move on to the next version and talk about. So I really like what I managed to do in a very small scale over here, where we create this little kind of extra corridor almost. I could see us having 2 wide corridors, and then in some places just creating little extra nooks and crannies for players to hide in, and if they're shifting, the player might run right past them in this sort of bleak environment that they won't see, and that could create some interesting situations when players have got down inside the chunk and grabbed some resources and are on their way out. And then the second thing I want to talk about is these end portal frames I've used here. And now while they wouldn't normally appear in the ends, I definitely want to try and include these in some way, because we're not including those in the stronghold, and I think it adds a little bit more interest to the environment. And I have a neat idea for a way they might help a new player just to find their way around the maze a bit more. And you'll be able to see what I mean by that in the next version, which I'm going to go ahead and build now. So we'll take all of these concepts and do a first mock-up. Right, so we took our end with our sort of bleak and barren look and feel of the environment, and we came up with a couple of concepts of finding a way to get that inside the chunk with this maze idea. Mocked up a couple of ideas of the spaces and thought about the spawners and the pillars, and laid out some other interesting ways of moving around the environment and trying to confuse players. And this is what I've come up with as a final playtesting version. And I'm really pleased with how that looks, actually. It's got that end kind of feel with the obsidian pillars, blocky, bleak look on the sides. I may find a way of just kind of breaking into this a little bit to mix up the look and feel and have it maybe look more like a floating island by cutting into the side like this. But the internals I'm really happy with so far, so let's go and have a look at those. And I've torched up some of the insides so you can see them. You might also see that I've popped in 2 Enderman spawners. There's one in this corner and one on this corner, and I've left spaces on these 2 chunks, these 2 pillars, to put an extra one in if I need to, and that's going to have to be something I playtest, whether I leave it entirely natural Enderman spawns, whether I want 2 spawners on top or 4. So let's drop down into the basement and take a look around. We've got our first level here, and you can run around, and we've got a stairway down, so we hop down to the next level. Another stairway there. Running around, not sure where we are, a little bit disorientated, and eventually we'll come across this 1 wide doorway, and that's where we want to be. So there's our sort of secret entrance into the next level. A little cubby hole here, maybe for people to hide and shift in, and somebody might run past them and they could get out if they were carrying the key resources they picked up and waiting for their team to rescue them. And then right down into the basement we've got these 4 rooms which I've carried through this sort of end portal idea into, with a chest in the centre. And there are 4 of these rooms, all in the corners, all equidistant from each other. Ooh, that's a bit of a glitch there. All equidistant from each other, and some of the chests will have resources in and some won't. So the players will come down again into this area and then be confused as to which chest to go to first. And you can see I've put torches in around just so we could see, and I've put a couple on the back of each room here for now, which I may take out or I may leave in, I'm not sure yet. I wanted to do that just to give people a hint that they'd finally arrived at the right space, and here was the hidden treasure. But it might be better just to leave it dark in here and have players only really come across light if it's player placed light and they know somebody's already in there. So that's the quick tour. I can't think of any other ideas I've got for this right now, so I'm going to go ahead today and finish up the episode. But if you've got any thoughts about the end chunk, or other things that I could include that I've missed, or you think that are features of the end, then please do let me know in the comments below. And until next time, bye bye!